I am Julian, and I am 32 years old. For months ago, my own brother burst into my business in the middle of the night, shattered my peace, and violently accused me of getting his fiancée pregnant. While I was desperately trying to defend my innocence and save my livelihood from total destruction, my parents looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a disgusting predator. They said they wished I had never been born. They humiliated me in front of our entire extended family, completely cut me out of their lives without a single shred of hesitation, and threw me to the wolves to protect their golden child. But there was one major thing they did not know. I had security cameras with high-definition audio, a razor-sharp defamation lawyer who never loses, and hard, undeniable digital forensics on my side. And right now, the very same people who threw me away are the ones begging on their knees for my forgiveness while staring down a massive, life-ruining lawsuit that will strip them of everything they own. Before I tell you exactly how I tore their malicious lies apart piece by piece, hit that like button if you believe in real, unapologetic justice. And do not forget to let me know exactly where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us go back to the exact moment where this absolute nightmare started. It was a late Tuesday night in early November. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, drumming relentlessly against the large glass storefront windows of my IT repair shop. I was staying late, working on a highly complex data recovery project for a local dental clinic, just enjoying the quiet, steady hum of the server racks. My lead technician, a brilliant guy named Elias, was in the back storage room finishing up some inventory counts for the week. The front door was locked, or at least I thought it was. Suddenly, the heavy glass door was violently yanked open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall. The cheerful security bell chimed, but that innocent sound was immediately drowned out by the heavy, aggressive, soaking wet footsteps of my older brother, Marcus. He was drenched from the storm, his eyes were entirely bloodshot, and he was breathing heavily, his chest heaving like a cornered wild animal. Before I could even stand up from my stool or ask him what on earth was wrong, he stormed across the pristine showroom floor, slammed his massive hands down on my glass front counter, and screamed at the absolute top of his lungs. He told me I was a dead man. He told me that his fiancée, Chloe, was pregnant, and that she had just sat in their living room, crying her eyes out, confessing to him that I was the father of her unborn child. I just stood there frozen behind the counter. I remember the exact, terrifying feeling blooming in the center of my chest. It felt exactly like someone had taken a syringe of freezing ice water and injected it directly into my veins. All the air instantly left my lungs. I blinked rapidly, trying desperately to process the absolute, sickening absurdity of what he was saying to my face. I looked at him and told him he was completely out of his mind. I told him clearly and firmly that I had never laid a single finger on Chloe, never looked at her in any romantic capacity, and never spent a single solitary second alone with her outside of this very shop during normal business hours. Marcus did not care about my words. He did not care about basic logic or the fact that I was his own flesh and blood. He lunged entirely across the counter, grabbing the collar of my work shirt in his fists, twisting the heavy fabric so tight it immediately began choking me. He spat directly in my face, his voice cracking with rage, telling me that Chloe gave him exact dates, exact times, and sickeningly specific details. Elias heard the commotion and came sprinting out from the back room, shouting at the top of his lungs, and physically had to pry my raging brother off of me. Marcus violently shoved Elias away, pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face, and swore on his life that he would destroy my business and my reputation. Then he turned around and walked back out into the pouring rain, leaving the front door wide open to the storm. I stood there catching my breath, thinking that physical altercation was the worst of it. I was so incredibly naive. Less than 2 hours later, while I was sitting in my dark apartment trying to calm my racing heart, my cell phone started ringing. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Eleanor. I answered the phone instantly, genuinely expecting her to be the voice of reason. I expected her to ask me what on earth Marcus was screaming about and to help me defuse the situation. Instead, the very second I picked up the phone, I was met with the cold, venomous, unrecognizable tone of a woman who had already served as judge, jury, and executioner. She did not ask me for my side of the story. She did not ask for a single shred of proof. She simply told me, in a voice dripping with absolute disgust, that I was a monster. She said I had brought unspeakable, permanent shame to our family name. I tried to speak, to beg her to just listen to me for 1 minute, but she cut me off sharply. She told me that she and my father were officially contacting their estate lawyer in the morning to completely write me out of their will. She made it a point to say they were stripping away any future inheritance, and that as far as they were concerned, they only had one son moving forward. Before I could even process that devastating blow, my father took the phone from her hand. My father, the man who proudly taught me how to ride a bike, who I had looked up to my entire life as my moral compass. He told me I was a sick, twisted individual. He said I was permanently banned from the upcoming family Thanksgiving dinner, banned from setting foot on their property ever again, and that if I ever tried to contact them or Marcus again, they would call the local police and file criminal harassment charges against me. The line went dead with a sharp click. I stood completely alone in my quiet, empty apartment that night, staring blankly at the dark screen of my phone. The silence in the room was absolutely deafening. In the span of a single, chaotic evening, my entire family had branded me a predator. They did not just casually believe a lie. They fully embraced it. They wanted to believe it. They truly thought I would just put my head down, accept the massive shame, and quietly disappear from the town to protect the family's precious reputation. They thought I would break under the immense weight of their rejection. But they were entirely wrong. To understand exactly why this manipulative monster targeted me in the first place, and why my parents were so terribly quick to throw their own son away, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back 4 months to see where the poison was first planted. Growing up in our household, there was always a very clear, unspoken divide. Marcus was the undisputed golden boy. He was 4 years older than me, the star high school quarterback, the charismatic charmer who could smoothly talk his way out of absolutely any trouble with a flashing smile. I was the quiet one, the introverted kid who genuinely liked computers, who preferred staying in his room building complex circuit boards while Marcus was out throwing wild parties and wrecking family cars. My parents absolutely worshipped the ground Marcus walked on. When it was time for college, the entire family college fund, every single penny they had saved for decades, went directly to Marcus so he could attend a highly prestigious out-of-state university without worrying about working. I stayed behind in our hometown, took out massive student loans, and drove a beat-up sedan to the local community college. I never complained about the disparity. I just put my head down and worked. I built my IT business completely from scratch, working brutal 80-hour weeks until I finally had a steady, highly respectable income. Marcus, on the other hand, just coasted through life. He went through an incredibly messy divorce in his late 20s, fighting a bitter custody battle over a golden retriever, eventually moved back into my parents' basement, and my parents blindly blamed his ex-wife for absolutely everything. In their eyes, Marcus could do no wrong. So, when Marcus proudly brought his new girlfriend, Chloe, to a Sunday family dinner for the very first time, my parents were more than ready to roll out the red carpet. I remember that specific dinner perfectly. Chloe was 30 years old, dressed in a sharp, clearly expensive designer dress, carrying herself with this incredibly fragile, soft-spoken demeanor. My parents were instantly captivated by her performance. But it took me less than an hour of sitting across from her at the dining table to see the deep, ugly cracks in her mask. Chloe had this incredibly toxic, calculated habit of delivering vicious insults perfectly disguised as sweet, caring compliments. During dessert, she looked directly at my mother, who had just spent 6 exhausting hours cooking a massive roast, and smiled warmly. She said it was just so incredibly brave of my mother to continue serving such heavy, outdated traditional dishes when everyone else in society was focusing on modern, healthy diets. My mother, completely blinded by her desperate need to please Marcus's new girl, actually smiled and thanked her for the observation. Later that same evening, Chloe turned to my cousin and praised her for wearing a dress that really highlighted her wide hips, calling her fashion choice fearless. Every single word that came out of Chloe's mouth was a carefully calculated manipulation designed to establish immediate social dominance in the room. I sat there, eating my food in complete silence, absolutely refusing to play her twisted game. I did not laugh at her rehearsed jokes. I did not feed her massive ego. I just observed her quietly, and Chloe absolutely hated that. She hated that she could not charm me or bend me to her will. A few weeks after that dinner, Marcus cornered me at a family barbecue. He aggressively informed me that Chloe had recently quit her corporate job under what he called stressful circumstances, and that she desperately needed a part-time job while she planned their upcoming lavish wedding. Marcus essentially demanded that I hire her as a client relations manager at my shop. I immediately looked him in the eye and said no. I told him firmly that my business dealt with highly sensitive data, and I needed experienced, dedicated professionals, not someone looking for wedding money. That night, my parents called my cell phone. They completely tag-teamed me. My mother cried hysterically, saying I was being a selfish, unsupportive brother who wanted to see Marcus fail. My father sternly threatened to stop speaking to me altogether if I did not step up and help family when they needed it most. Against every single protective instinct in my body, I caved to the intense emotional pressure. I called Chloe and offered her the job. It was the single biggest mistake of my entire life. Chloe was an absolute nightmare from day one. She consistently showed up 40 minutes late, carrying a luxury iced coffee, acting like she owned the entire building. She was incredibly rude and dismissive to my long-term, loyal clients. She talked down to Elias, my lead technician, constantly interrupting him while he was diagnosing complicated hardware issues for paying customers. She spent at least half of her paid shift scrolling through social media or loudly planning her wedding flower arrangements on company time. I tried my absolute best to manage her professionally. I pulled her into my office and gave her formal verbal warnings. I documented every single instance of her terrible behavior. But she always played the ultimate victim, running straight to Marcus and completely twisting the story, claiming I was creating a deeply hostile work environment because I was secretly jealous of their perfect relationship. The absolute breaking point happened exactly 1 month after she started. I had a major, incredibly lucrative contract with Dr. Eris Thorne, a prominent director of a local medical clinic. He also personally managed a massive portfolio of commercial real estate. We were servicing his personal, encrypted laptop, which contained highly sensitive, HIPAA-protected patient medical data and highly confidential financial records. I walked out of the back storage room with a fresh cup of coffee and caught Chloe sitting directly at the main repair bench. She had a personal USB thumb drive plugged directly into Dr. Thorne's machine. She was actively clicking and browsing through secure folders clearly labeled with patient names and monthly financial summaries. My blood ran absolutely cold. I walked over, immediately reached past her, pulled the USB drive out of the port, and firmly demanded to know exactly what she thought she was doing. Chloe did not even flinch or look guilty. She just rolled her eyes dramatically, let out a loud, theatrical sigh, and said she was just curious about how much money a fancy doctor like that actually made in a year. I fired her on the spot. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her excuses. I simply told her to pack her personal belongings, hand over her shop keys, and leave my property immediately before I called the local police for attempting to steal highly confidential client data. Then, the fragile victim mask completely slipped off her face. Chloe stood up from the stool. The sweet, innocent persona vanished entirely. She looked at me with a cold, dead, terrifying expression. But instead of yelling or causing a scene, she did something that made my stomach physically turn. She stepped dangerously close to me, invading my personal space. She slowly unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of her silk blouse, leaned in until I could smell her overwhelming, suffocating perfume, and gently trailed her manicured fingers down the center of my chest. She whispered in a sickeningly sweet voice that if I gave her a substantial salary raise and let her stay, she could easily make it worth my while. She looked me up and down and explicitly said Marcus was incredibly boring in bed anyway. I physically recoiled as if I had been burned. I violently shoved her hand away with absolute disgust and told her she made me physically sick. I pointed to the door and told her to get out of my sight. The harsh rejection hit her like a physical blow to the face. Her features twisted into pure, unadulterated hatred. She grabbed her expensive purse off the counter, leaned in very close to my face, and hissed, "You are going to regret that for the rest of your miserable life." 2 hours later, Marcus called me, screaming through the phone. Chloe had gone straight home sobbing uncontrollably, telling him I had viciously fired her because she flatly refused to do my personal errands. My parents called next, aggressively demanding I drive over to Marcus's house immediately and apologize on my knees. I refused. I told them exactly what she did, about the sensitive data breach, about her completely inappropriate behavior. My mother scoffed loudly into the phone. "Chloe is a sweet, innocent girl. You are just bitter and lonely. You will apologize, Julian, or you will have hell to pay." I hung up the phone. I honestly thought she was just an entitled, crazy woman who would eventually fade into the background of my life. I had absolutely no idea she was currently sitting in her house, plotting a revenge so calculated and devastating it would nearly wipe me off the map. The horrible accusation was not just a private family matter kept behind closed doors. Chloe and my family made absolutely sure of that. They did not just want me casually removed from the family functions. They wanted me entirely eradicated from the community. Merely days after Marcus stormed into my shop and made his insane claims, the toxic whispers started. I live in a mid-sized, tight-knit town where absolutely everyone knows everyone else's business. My Aunt Clara, the absolute undisputed gossip queen of our extended family, took it upon herself to be the official town crier. Under the fake guise of being a deeply concerned relative, she started spreading the horrific story at her monthly HOA meetings, at the upscale local country club, and even in the aisles of the grocery store. She told absolutely everyone who would listen that poor, innocent Chloe was pregnant, and that the evil, predatory brother-in-law had taken advantage of her in the back room of his computer shop while she was vulnerable. I started noticing the devastating shift in my daily life immediately. People I had known for years, the friendly guy who poured my black coffee at the corner diner every morning, the familiar teller at my local bank, my own next-door neighbors, started looking at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Normal, friendly conversations would stop dead the second I walked into a room. Mothers would literally physically pull their children closer to their sides when I walked past them on the public sidewalk. I was a walking pariah in my own hometown. Desperate to stop the bleeding, I tried to reach out to my parents one last time. I drove my car to their suburban house, genuinely hoping that looking them directly in the eye would snap them out of this insane delusion. I stood on their familiar front porch and knocked firmly. My mother slowly opened the heavy wooden door, but she kept the brass chain lock engaged, staring out at me through the narrow crack like I was a dangerous stranger holding a weapon. "Mom," I pleaded, my voice cracking with emotion. "Please, you know me. I am your son. I have never been in trouble a day in my life. I would never, ever do something like this. She is lying to you." My mother's eyes were stone cold, completely devoid of any maternal warmth or love. She looked at me and said the exact words that finally broke my heart into pieces. "There is no smoke without fire, Julian. You always were the jealous one. You just could not stand that Marcus was finally happy and getting married, so you ruined it. Do not ever come back here." She slammed the heavy door forcefully in my face. I heard the loud click of the deadbolt sliding into place. I walked slowly back to my car, got into the driver's seat, and gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. My own mother. Desperate for just a single ally, later that evening I answered an incoming call from my cousin, Leo. Leo sounded incredibly sympathetic on the phone. He told me he thought things were getting way out of hand with Aunt Clara's gossip and asked how I was holding up mentally. Starving for any shred of family connection, I foolishly let my guard down. I told him I was an absolute wreck, but that I was actively looking into legal options to force a mandatory DNA test to finally clear my name. I told him the truth would eventually come out and prove them all wrong. I did not know Leo had me on speakerphone in his living room. I did not know he was actively recording the entire emotional conversation. The very next morning, a series of screenshots from the extended family group chat were leaked to me by an anonymous number. Leo had taken our private conversation, viciously twisted my words, and told the entire family that I had tearfully confessed to sleeping with her and was now frantically trying to figure out how to illegally rig a paternity DNA test. He called me a manipulative psychopath. Every single family member in that chat replied with supportive heart emojis for Chloe and green vomit emojis for me. Leo was not an ally. He was a two-faced spy farming for drama to entertain the family. The emotional toll of the isolation was crushing, but the financial toll was clearly meant to completely destroy my life. Exactly 1 week later, Dr. Thorne walked into my shop. He did not look angry. He just looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He reached into his briefcase and handed me a formal, typed letter of termination. He was immediately pulling all of his clinic's lucrative IT contracts, his real estate firm's server management, and his high-paying personal accounts. I looked at him stunned and asked him why. His clinic alone accounted for a massive portion of my monthly revenue. He would not even meet my eyes. He just sighed heavily and said, "Julian, you do really good technical work, but I run a highly respected medical facility. My board members go to the exact same country club as your aunt. The optics of this situation, the awful rumors, I simply cannot have my business associated with this kind of scandalous liability." In the painfully short span of 2 weeks, my business revenue dropped by a catastrophic 70%. Other local businesses quickly followed Dr. Thorne's lead, canceling their monthly retainers with vague excuses. I had to make the agonizing decision to let my 2 junior technicians go because I could not make payroll. I started burning rapidly through my personal salary savings and my emergency funds just to keep the lights on and pay the massive commercial rent for the storefront. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I was drinking way too much black coffee, sitting alone staring at the blank walls of my empty shop, waiting for the final nail to be hammered into the coffin. I was actively drowning in a violent storm of lies, and nobody was throwing me a life preserver. That Friday evening, as the sun was setting, the door to my shop opened. It was my fiercely loyal best friend from high school, Sarah, and my lead tech, Elias. Sarah did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer empty pity or sad looks. She walked right up to my desk, slammed a thick yellow legal notepad down on the glass, and looked me dead in the eyes. "Are you entirely done feeling sorry for yourself?" she demanded sharply. I looked at her, completely exhausted to my bones. "Sarah, my own family thinks I am a monster. My business is dying a slow death. What exactly do you want me to do?" Elias stepped up beside her. "Boss, you are the smartest guy I know. You literally fix broken, corrupted systems for a living. So let us fix this. We do not sit around in the dark and wait for pathological liars to magically grow a conscience. We completely destroy their fake narrative." Sarah reached into her purse and handed me a business card. It was thick, premium black cardstock with sharp silver lettering. "This is Vance," she said firmly. "He is the absolute most ruthless defamation lawyer in the entire state. He does not play nice, he does not settle for apologies, and he does not lose. I already booked you a consultation for tomorrow morning. You are going to fight back." I looked down at the sleek card in my hand. A tiny spark, incredibly small but fiercely hot, ignited deep in my chest. For long, agonizing weeks, I had been playing a weak defense. I had been practically begging for my family's love, begging for the town to believe my innocence. But Elias and Sarah were absolutely right. You do not beg a rabid dog not to bite you. You put it down. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. The storm was just beginning, but I was no longer running from it. I was walking right into the absolute center. Lawyer Vance was not a warm, comforting man. When I walked into his high-end downtown office the next morning, he did not offer me coffee or tea. He did not offer me a shoulder to cry on or empty sympathy. He sat rigidly behind a massive, imposing mahogany desk, wearing a tailored suit, and listened to my entire horrifying story for exactly 20 minutes without interrupting a single time. When I finished, he leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Julian," Vance said, his voice grating like heavy gravel, "your family is operating entirely on blind emotion and protective instinct. Chloe is operating on pure malice and a desire for revenge. We are going to operate strictly on facts. And facts do not care about your mother's delicate feelings, your brother's fragile ego, or your aunt's country club gossip. But I need you to understand something right now. This is going to get very ugly before it gets better. Are you fully prepared to burn these family bridges entirely to the ground?" I thought about my mother's locked door and her cold eyes. I thought about Marcus's hands violently tightening around my throat. I thought about Leo's treacherous group chat messages. "Burn them," I said, my voice steady. "Burn them all to the ground." Vance went to work immediately. He was not just a lawyer. He was an apex predator hunting for fatal weaknesses. While I went back to managing the miserable scraps of my failing business, Vance hired a highly skilled private investigator to dig deep into Chloe's employment and personal past. A pathological liar with this level of audacity rarely starts their career with a grand masterpiece of deception. They always leave a messy trail of smaller fires and ruined lives behind them. 2 incredibly tense weeks later, Vance called me to come into his office. Sitting nervously in one of the plush leather chairs across from his desk was a woman I had never seen before. She looked incredibly anxious, clutching her purse. Vance introduced her as Maya. She was a former co-worker of Chloe's from a mid-sized advertising agency 2 states over. Maya looked at me, wringing her hands nervously. "I really shouldn't be here," she whispered, looking toward the door. "Chloe is dangerous. But Mr. Vance showed me exactly what she is doing to you and your business. And I couldn't sleep at night knowing I kept quiet." Maya took a deep breath and told us the shocking truth. 3 years ago, Chloe had desperately tried to secure a massive corporate promotion and a huge salary bump by getting highly inappropriately close to her department director, a happily married man with 3 young kids. When the director firmly rejected her aggressive advances and reported her behavior to HR to protect himself, Chloe instantly flipped the script. She filed a horrific, incredibly detailed sexual harassment complaint against him. She cried hysterically in the office. She played the ultimate victim. The director was suspended without pay. His marriage almost fell apart under the stress, and his professional reputation was dragged through the mud. "How did he ever clear his name?" I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs. "He didn't have to do it himself," Maya said, shaking her head. HR pulled the hidden security footage from the stairwell where she claimed the violent assault happened. The cameras caught her perfectly. They caught her violently ripping her own shirt, violently smudging her own makeup, and practicing her crying face before walking directly into the HR office. She was quietly fired that afternoon, and the company made the director sign a strict non-disclosure agreement to avoid a massive public lawsuit. She moved to this town a few months later to start fresh. Vance smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that promised absolute destruction. We now had a heavily documented history of malicious, false allegations used as direct retaliation for romantic rejection. We had the ultimate weapon. Now we just needed the perfect moment to strike. But Marcus was not going to wait for the slow turning of the legal system. The lies were driving him completely insane, twisting his mind with toxic jealousy and rage. It happened on a quiet Thursday night. I was completely alone in the shop, running long diagnostic tests on a server rack. The street outside was dead quiet. Suddenly, the deafening, explosive sound of shattering glass ripped through the silent room. I instinctively dove behind the heavy oak repair counter just as a massive, heavy landscaping brick skidded violently across the tile floor, completely destroying a glass display case full of expensive hardware and motherboards. I jumped up. Marcus was actively climbing through the jagged, shattered remains of my front window. He absolutely reeked of cheap whiskey and blind rage. His hands were bleeding profusely from the broken glass, but he did not even seem to feel it. He was practically foaming at the mouth, screaming that I was dragging the legal process out, that Chloe was suffering from severe pregnancy stress, and that he was going to kill me with his bare hands right there on the floor. He lunged at me with a wild roar, but I was not the shocked, paralyzed, passive victim from 4 months ago. As he swung a wild, heavy, drunken punch directly at my head, I quickly stepped inside his guard. I let my years of suppressed anger, the agonizing pain of my mother's rejection, the loss of my business, and the sheer injustice of it all channel into one single, precise, explosive motion. I drove my right fist directly into Marcus's jaw with everything I had. There was a sickening, loud crack that echoed in the empty shop. Marcus's eyes instantly rolled back in his head. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the tile floor like a heavy sack of concrete. He did not move. I did not panic. I did not rush to his side to check on him or apologize. I coldly stepped over my brother's unconscious, bleeding body, pulled my cell phone out of my pocket, and calmly dialed 911. Detective Reynolds arrived exactly 10 minutes later with 2 flashing patrol cars. The high-definition security cameras inside my shop captured absolutely everything in crystal-clear detail. The unprovoked, violent attack, the massive property damage, the clear self-defense. The paramedics patched up Marcus, and the officers handcuffed my bleeding, groggy brother and dragged him roughly into the back of a squad car. I stood on the wet sidewalk, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching the red and blue lights flash against the brick buildings. I officially pressed formal, criminal charges against my own brother for felony assault, breaking and entering, and destruction of commercial property. An hour later, my phone rang. It was my mother. The news of the arrest had already reached her. "You absolute monster!" she shrieked into the phone, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Your brother is sitting in a filthy jail cell. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? You are sending him to state prison over a broken window." I stood in the middle of my completely shattered shop, crunching broken glass beneath my heavy work boots. "He threw a brick through my window, Mom. He tried to end my life. He was fiercely defending his pregnant fiancée and his family," she screamed back, completely unhinged. "You deserve absolutely everything you are getting. I will make sure you rot for this, Julian. I will spend every single dime of our money. I will sell the house if I have to ruin you in court." I let out a slow, steady breath. The absolute last, fraying thread of hope I had for my family completely snapped in that moment. The grief was entirely gone. Only a cold, absolute, unshakable resolve remained. "Save your money, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm and deadly quiet, "because very soon you're going to need every single penny of it to pay my legal fees." I hung up the phone and permanently blocked her number. The storm was raging all around me, but I was no longer afraid of the lightning. I was completely ready to bring the thunder. I truly thought the worst was over. I thought the physical violence was the absolute peak of this nightmare. I was so incredibly wrong, because the real, earth-shattering explosion was not going to happen in a street fight. It was going to happen in a sterile courtroom, and it was going to destroy them all. The American legal system is an incredibly slow, grinding, and unforgiving machine. It is deliberately designed to exhaust you, to completely drain your bank account, and to brutally test the absolute limits of your mental sanity. For long, agonizing weeks after my brother Marcus was officially arrested for throwing a heavy landscaping brick through my shop window, the silence from my immediate family was absolutely deafening. There were no phone calls checking on my well-being. There were no text messages asking for my side of the story. There was only a cold, impenetrable wall of rejection. But while they were sitting comfortably in their suburban homes, blindly confident in their golden boy and his fragile fiancée, the legal warfare I was silently orchestrating was just beginning to heat up behind the scenes. Lawyer Vance did not just file a simple, standard legal response to the horrific rumors circulating around our mid-sized town. He launched a full-scale, shock-and-awe legal assault designed to completely dismantle the opposition. We officially filed a massive civil lawsuit for aggravated defamation, intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and tortious interference with my highly lucrative business contracts. We naturally named Chloe as the primary defendant, but Vance expertly and ruthlessly drafted the legal language to make it abundantly clear that absolutely anyone actively participating in the spread of these malicious lies could, and would, be swiftly added to the massive lawsuit. That specific legal threat sent a massive, terrifying shockwave through my entire extended family network. Suddenly, the rampant, toxic gossip ground to a screeching halt. My Aunt Clara, who had been gleefully spreading the horrific narrative at her upscale country club and neighborhood HOA meetings, suddenly stopped talking about me altogether. Cousin Leo, the treacherous spy who had manipulated my private phone call, frantically deleted his lengthy group chat messages, desperately trying to erase his digital footprint. They were all incredibly brave when destroying my life was just free, entertaining neighborhood gossip, but the absolute second their own personal bank accounts, their comfortable retirement funds, and their valuable real estate assets were directly threatened by a ruthless, high-powered lawyer, they scattered like terrified cockroaches fleeing from a bright light. The very first major battleground was the preliminary injunction hearing. We were sitting in the heavily air-conditioned, imposing, mahogany-paneled courtroom of Judge Robert Harrington. Judge Harrington was a notoriously strict, deeply conservative judge widely known throughout the county for having zero tolerance for courtroom nonsense or theatrical displays. He was a traditional man who deeply respected the fundamental sanctity of family and marriage, which theoretically made him the absolutely perfect target for Chloe's highly calculated, emotionally manipulative victim routine. When the heavy, brass-handled wooden doors of the courtroom slowly swung open, Chloe walked down the center aisle firmly holding Marcus's hand. They were closely flanked by my parents, Arthur and Eleanor. As they walked past the plaintiff's table where I was seated next to Vance, my parents looked down at me. There was absolutely no parental love in their eyes. There was not even a microscopic flicker of hesitation or doubt. They glared at me with pure, unadulterated, righteous hatred, fully believing with every fiber of their being that they were sitting on the righteous side of history, fiercely protecting a highly vulnerable pregnant woman from a wealthy, predatory business owner. Chloe was dressed absolutely perfectly for the specific part she was playing. She wore a highly modest, loose-fitting pastel floral dress that subtly hinted at a newly maternal figure. Her makeup was expertly and minimally applied to purposely make her look incredibly pale, physically exhausted, and deeply traumatized by the ongoing ordeal. She carried a crumpled tissue in her trembling hand, constantly dabbing at her completely dry eyes. She looked exactly like the helpless, terrified victim she repeatedly claimed to be. Her defense attorney, a flashy, overconfident guy wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit who clearly thought this was going to be an incredibly easy settlement case, stood up proudly and immediately began painting a horrific, totally fabricated picture for the judge. He confidently told Judge Harrington that I was a deeply bitter, isolated, and jealous man who maliciously used his position of power as a prominent business owner to corner and brutally assault his innocent client. He aggressively claimed that officially ordering a mandatory, court-supervised prenatal DNA test would cause severe, potentially catastrophic emotional distress to the unborn fetus. He passionately argued that the court should legally protect the victim's fragile mental health and simply accept the medical documentation they had already happily provided. A thick stack of printed ultrasound photos and a supposedly signed, official letter from a local women's clinic confirming the pregnancy. Judge Harrington listened carefully from his elevated bench, nodding slightly, clearly emotionally moved by Chloe's soft, trembling sobs perfectly echoing in the quiet, tense courtroom. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, my stomach completely dropped into my shoes. I truly thought the conservative judge was going to officially deny the crucial motion for the DNA test. I thought her fake, manipulative tears were actually going to win the day and permanently seal my terrible fate. Then, Lawyer Vance slowly stood up. Vance did not raise his deep, gravelly voice. He did not act overly outraged or theatrical. He simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, picked up a massive, thick manila folder from our table, and walked smoothly and confidently toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice incredibly cold, commanding, and cutting through the heavy emotional tension in the room like a freshly sharpened surgical scalpel. The plaintiff absolutely does not dispute that the defendant is currently exhibiting signs of severe emotional distress in your courtroom today. However, we heavily and fundamentally dispute the underlying, factual cause of that visible distress. We firmly believe the defendant is not distressed because of an imaginary assault, but because she is currently facing the catastrophic, unavoidable legal consequences of a heavily documented, historical pattern of malicious, retaliatory perjury. Chloe's fake, trembling crying instantly stopped dead. Her head snapped up so fast I thought she might injure her neck. Marcus looked completely confused, leaning far forward in his hard wooden pew. My mother's jaw tightened visibly. Vance handed the thick folder directly to the armed bailiff, who immediately handed it up to Judge Harrington. Your Honor, inside that comprehensive folder, you will find a sworn, legally notarized affidavit from a Ms. Maya Reynolds, a former professional colleague of the defendant at a prominent advertising firm in the neighboring state. You will also find heavily redacted, official corporate HR records and a strictly enforced non-disclosure agreement. Exactly 3 years ago, the defendant was officially terminated for cause after she aggressively and inappropriately pursued a married senior executive, was firmly and professionally rejected, and subsequently filed a completely fabricated, highly detailed, and deeply damaging claim of sexual assault in direct, malicious retaliation. The entire packed courtroom went absolutely, terrifyingly dead silent. You literally could have heard a single pin drop onto the carpeted floor. Vance continued, his powerful voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. The defendant's previous corporate employer wisely utilized hidden stairwell security cameras to catch her intentionally and violently ripping her own professional clothing and aggressively smudging her own makeup to successfully fake the aftermath of the alleged assault. The plaintiff in this current civil case, my client, Julian, recently fired the defendant for attempting to unlawfully steal highly confidential, HIPAA-protected patient medical data belonging to a prominent local clinic. Her immediate response to being lawfully fired and romantically rejected was to instantly initiate this exact same, deeply unhinged playbook of pure retaliation. We are absolutely not asking this court to harass a genuinely pregnant woman. We are firmly asking the court to medically verify if a pregnancy even exists before my client's entire life, his thriving business, and his spotless reputation are permanently and violently destroyed by a proven, pathological liar. Judge Harrington's entire demeanor changed in an absolute, blinding instant. The sympathetic, fatherly look in his eyes completely vanished, instantly replaced by the sharp, incredibly dangerous glare of a seasoned judge who realizes someone is actively trying to make an absolute fool out of his highly respected courtroom. He rapidly flipped through the corporate HR records, his eyes scanning the damning details of Chloe's past, documented deception. Chloe's defense lawyer jumped up, stammering uncontrollably, his face turning bright, embarrassed red. Your Honor, I strongly object. This is an absolutely outrageous, completely unfounded character assassination. My client's past employment history has absolutely zero legal bearing on the current, undeniable medical fact of her ongoing pregnancy. Counselor? Judge Harrington interrupted sharply, his voice booming with absolute, terrifying authority. If your client is telling the honest truth about the paternity of this child, then a simple, highly routine, non-invasive prenatal DNA blood test will conclusively prove her claims and significantly strengthen your massive civil countersuit against the plaintiff. But given the highly concerning, heavily documented history of fraud just presented to me, this court is absolutely no longer going to blindly operate on blind faith and printed pieces of paper. He violently slammed his heavy wooden gavel down on the sounding block. I am officially ordering an immediate court-mandated, legally supervised prenatal paternity test. It will be conducted at a strictly independent, state-certified forensic clinic explicitly chosen by this court, not by the defendant or her legal team. And let me make this incredibly crystal clear to absolutely everyone sitting in this room today. If the results of this official test show any signs of tampering whatsoever, or if the defendant refuses to fully comply with the medical staff, I will immediately hold her in criminal contempt of court and she will sit in a jail cell. We are adjourned. I let out a massive, shaky breath I didn't even know I was holding. I looked back at the gallery seating. Marcus looked completely bewildered, staring at Chloe with a sudden, microscopic flicker of genuine doubt in his eyes. My parents looked deeply uncomfortable, aggressively whispering frantically to each other. But the absolute most satisfying reaction was from Chloe herself. The soft, fragile, completely fake victim mask had completely melted away. She was glaring directly at Lawyer Vance with a look of pure, highly concentrated sociopathic venom. But oddly enough, as we confidently walked out of the massive courthouse doors and into the bright sunlight, Chloe did not look terrified or panicked. She looked violently angry, yes, but not utterly defeated. I quietly whispered to Vance, asking him why on earth she wasn't having a total public meltdown. If the DNA test was going to definitively prove I wasn't the father, shouldn't she be running for the hills? Vance just looked at me with a sharp, terrifying, knowing smile. Julian, pathological liars absolutely do not think or process reality like normal, rational human beings. They suffer from an extreme, deeply ingrained delusion of complete invincibility. She actually believes she is significantly smarter than the medical doctors, much smarter than the state forensic lab, and infinitely smarter than the law itself. She genuinely thinks she can somehow manipulate the test, or endlessly delay it with fake medical excuses, or simply bribe a clinic worker. Let her be wildly confident. The higher they proudly build their towering pedestal of lies, the harder the concrete floor hits them when they inevitably fall. The sheer psychological weight of waiting for the official clinic appointment was absolute, unadulterated agony. My IT repair business was still actively hemorrhaging money on a daily basis. I was strictly living off my rapidly depleting savings account, watching my hard-earned financial security evaporate. Every single time I bravely walked down the familiar street to grab basic groceries, I could still heavily feel the judgmental, burning stares of my longtime neighbors. The toxic rumors were still actively circulating. A piece of paper from a judge did not magically clear my name in the brutal court of public opinion. I needed hard, undeniable, absolute scientific proof to finally wash the stain from my reputation. The highly anticipated day of the court-ordered test finally arrived. We all met at the state-certified forensic clinic downtown. The medical protocol was incredibly strict and completely unforgiving. There was rigorous government ID verification, digital fingerprinting, and a documented chain of custody for the blood samples that was practically bulletproof. Chloe walked into the sterile waiting room wearing massive designer sunglasses, completely ignoring my presence. She strutted in with her chin held incredibly high, radiating absolute, breathtaking arrogance. She looked at the hard-working nurses with pure, unmasked disdain, acting like this entire legal procedure was nothing more than a minor, irritating inconvenience to her incredibly important daily schedule. She was utterly, completely convinced she was going to get away with it. She walked into the back medical room to have her blood drawn. I gave my official sample exactly 10 minutes later. Then, the agonizing, incredibly brutal 2-week waiting period officially began. Every single time my cell phone buzzed, my heart violently jumped into my throat. I couldn't focus on repairing complex motherboards. I couldn't focus on writing custom code for my remaining clients. My entire existence was suspended in pure, suffocating limbo, entirely dependent on a sterile, sealed laboratory report. My parents didn't call to check on me. Marcus didn't call to apologize for the shattered window. The family had firmly drawn their aggressive battle lines, and they were firmly entrenched behind their golden boy and his perfect, innocent fiancée. Finally, 14 exhausting days later, Vance called me. His gravelly voice was completely flat, betraying absolutely no emotion over the phone. "Julian, the officially sealed laboratory results are in my possession. Dress in your absolute best tailored suit. We are going back to the courthouse tomorrow morning. It is finally time to end this." The second hearing was absolutely packed to maximum capacity. Word had clearly gotten around the extended family network that the highly anticipated DNA results were officially being opened and read in open court. My Aunt Clara was sitting right in the second row, whispering furiously and dramatically to Cousin Leo. My parents were sitting directly behind the defense table, their hands clasped tightly together, looking incredibly pale, tired, and deeply anxious. Marcus sat rigidly next to Chloe, nervously bouncing his knee up and down in a rapid rhythm. Chloe, staying entirely true to her deep narcissistic nature, was still actively playing her role perfectly. She was softly holding her completely flat stomach, wiping away invisible tears, acting exactly like a brave, persecuted martyr facing a cruel, unjust inquisition. Judge Harrington took his high seat at the massive wooden bench, looking down at the packed, tense room with an incredibly stern, unreadable expression. He held a thick, sealed manila envelope bearing the official, unbroken red wax seal of the State Forensics Laboratory. The court has officially received the verified results of the court-mandated prenatal paternity test. Judge Harrington announced loudly, his deep, commanding voice carrying easily to the very back row of the gallery. Counsel for both respective parties have been provided with highly secured digital copies this morning. For the official court record, I will now state the definitive scientific findings. He cleanly sliced open the thick envelope, pulled out the crisp white document, and slowly adjusted his reading glasses. The silence in the massive room was so incredibly heavy it literally felt like you could cut it with a sharp knife. I violently gripped the edge of the wooden plaintiff's table so hard my knuckles turned white and my fingers ached. The scientific probability of paternity for the plaintiff, Julian, is absolute, definitive 0%. He is entirely, medically excluded as the biological father of the child in question. A collective, massive gasp violently rippled through the crowded gallery. Aunt Clara's manicured hand flew to her open mouth in total shock. Marcus froze completely, his knee instantly stopping its nervous bouncing. He slowly, mechanically turned his head to look directly at Chloe, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying, world-shattering realization. My mother let out a small, sharp, incredibly painful cry and desperately grabbed my father's suit arm. Chloe's cheap defense lawyer immediately jumped to his feet, frantically waving a piece of paper in the air. Your Honor, while we fully acknowledge these specific DNA results, this absolutely does not absolve the plaintiff of his highly inappropriate, aggressive workplace behavior. My client is still a highly vulnerable pregnant woman, and we will be actively seeking to instantly identify the true biological father to permanently clear her name of this targeted, malicious harassment. I felt a sudden, deeply sickening wave of dark despair violently wash over me. Even with the absolute DNA test proving my complete innocence, she was still going to ruthlessly spin the narrative. She was going to publicly claim she was just confused about the dates, or that I had somehow emotionally manipulated the situation, or that she was a tragic victim of someone else entirely. The toxic rumors in our town wouldn't stop. They would just conveniently shift their focus. She was still going to play the ultimate pregnant victim card for the rest of her life. But Lawyer Vance didn't even flinch. He slowly, deliberately stood up from his leather chair. He didn't look relieved by the DNA results at all. He looked exactly like a massive, starving wolf that had just cornered its bleeding, terrified prey. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a massive, incredibly heavy, 3-inch thick black binder. He slammed it down on the wooden table with an incredibly loud, resounding thud that made everyone jump. Your Honor, Vance said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating pure, incredibly lethal intent. The defense counsel is entirely correct. The DNA test only proves my client is not the biological father, but it completely fails to address the much larger, incredibly sinister, highly criminal fraud taking place directly inside your courtroom this very second. Judge Harrington frowned deeply, leaning far forward over his high bench. Counselor, explain yourself immediately. What exactly are you alleging? Vance picked up the heavy binder and walked directly to the center of the floor. During the agonizing 2-week waiting period for these scientific DNA results, my office absolutely did not sit idle. We employed a leading, highly expensive digital forensics firm to extensively and meticulously analyze the medical documentation the defendant formally submitted to this court to definitively prove her alleged pregnancy. Specifically, the 2 ultrasound photographs and the signed clinic verification letter. Vance pulled out a massive, high-resolution, blown-up poster board of the exact ultrasound picture Chloe had confidently submitted and placed it squarely on a wooden easel for the entire room to clearly see. This is the exact image the defendant formally submitted under direct penalty of perjury. It clearly shows a viable fetus, with the defendant's full name, Chloe, and a specific date printed clearly in the top right corner. However, when our highly trained digital forensics experts carefully extracted the deeply embedded EXIF metadata from the original digital PDF file she emailed to her legal counsel, they discovered something absolutely, undeniably fascinating. Vance pointed directly at the large poster board. The hidden metadata undeniably and definitively proves the specific image was heavily and intentionally modified using Adobe Photoshop on a personal laptop directly registered to the defendant exactly 3 days before she made her initial, explosive accusation against my client. Furthermore, the embedded digital source code of the original image proves it was literally downloaded directly from a commercial stock photography website. But that is not even the most damning piece of undeniable evidence, Your Honor. The courtroom was completely, utterly paralyzed. Nobody dared to take a single breath. Marcus looked like he was going to violently throw up his breakfast right there on the defense table. Vance pulled out another official document from the thick binder. We officially subpoenaed the specific medical clinic actively listed on the defendant's submitted letterhead. The exact clinic that supposedly signed her official pregnancy verification form. Your Honor, that specific branch of the Women's Health Network officially declared bankruptcy, completely closed its doors, shut down its medical servers, and went completely out of business 14 entire months ago. They have absolutely not seen or treated a single patient in well over a year. Vance slowly turned to look directly, intensely at Chloe. Her fragile, carefully constructed victim mask had completely, irreparably shattered into a million pieces. Her face was stark, ghostly white. Her eyes incredibly wide with absolute, primal terror. Her mouth was opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but absolutely no sound was coming out. Vance proudly turned back to the judge, his booming voice vibrating with absolute, righteous, unstoppable fury. Your Honor, the scientific DNA results are 0% because there is absolutely no baby. The defendant is not pregnant. She has never been pregnant. She entirely, maliciously fabricated a fake pregnancy, meticulously forged highly sensitive legal medical documents, committed blatant federal wire fraud, and committed severe, highly aggravated perjury directly in your courtroom, all to execute an incredibly calculated, malicious revenge plot against my client simply because he legally fired her for attempting to steal highly confidential client data. Absolute, unadulterated chaos immediately erupted in the courtroom. Marcus violently shoved his heavy wooden chair back, crashed loudly to the polished floor. He stood up, towering over the terrified Chloe, his face twisted in absolute, unfiltered horror and blinding rage. You lied! He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice breaking violently. You completely made this entire thing up. You let me physically attack my own brother. You let me go to a jail cell? Order! Order in my court! Judge Harrington roared, violently slamming his wooden gavel down repeatedly on the sounding block. The armed bailiffs rushed forward immediately, grabbing Marcus forcefully by the shoulders and aggressively forcing him to step back from the table. I looked completely past the screaming chaos and locked eyes with my parents sitting frozen in the gallery. My mother was actively hyperventilating, her shaking hands desperately clutching her chest. Her face was entirely drained of all color, staring in absolute, horrified, sickening disbelief at the treacherous woman she had confidently chosen over her own flesh and blood son. My father looked exactly like a completely broken, incredibly hollow shell of a man, his mouth hanging wide open in sheer, absolute shock. They had completely, willingly thrown away their loyal, hard-working son to fiercely and proudly protect a massive, grotesque, psychotic lie. Chloe's cheap defense attorney was standing completely, totally frozen at his table. He looked down at his own legal files in horror, looked at the massive binder Vance had confidently presented, and then slowly, deliberately, set his expensive silver pen down on the wood. He took 2 large, physical steps away from Chloe, completely and visibly distancing himself from his own highly toxic client. "Your Honor," the defense attorney stammered, his voice actively trembling with genuine, deep fear of being personally implicated in the massive perjury. The defense urgently and respectfully requests a brief, 15-minute recess to immediately confer with my client regarding these highly disturbing, catastrophic new evidentiary developments. Judge Harrington's face was dark, furious red with absolute, unrestrained fury. He glared down at Chloe with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust that could melt steel. "You have exactly 10 minutes, counselor, and I highly suggest you extensively explain to your client the massive, life-altering criminal penalties for committing aggravated perjury and document forgery in a federal court of law." The judge stormed angrily off the high bench. The courtroom instantly erupted into incredibly loud, panicked whispers. Aunt Clara literally ran out of the heavy back doors, desperate to quickly escape the massive, incoming fallout. Cousin Leo looked exactly like he desperately wanted to sink into the wooden floorboards and disappear forever. I sat back comfortably in my leather chair, looking closely at Lawyer Vance. I felt a massive, incredibly heavy physical weight instantly lift completely off my chest. The agonizing months of suffocating anxiety, the crushing daily paranoia, the deep, agonizing sting of my family's total betrayal. It all ultimately culminated in this exact, incredibly satisfying moment of pure, undeniable, blazing truth. I wasn't just completely cleared of the terrible accusations. My absolute innocence was a massive, blinding spotlight, and their disgusting guilt was completely, permanently exposed for the entire world to clearly see. Exactly 10 minutes later, the defense attorney walked back into the silent courtroom entirely alone. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped. He didn't even wait for the furious judge to sit down fully before he softly spoke. "Your Honor," he said incredibly quietly, his head bowed in deep shame. "The defense completely and unconditionally withdraws absolutely all previous statements and legal claims. My client officially and fully acknowledges the complete validity of the plaintiff's digital forensics report. There is absolutely no pregnancy. The medical documents were completely manufactured. We fully surrender to absolutely all civil claims and humbly ask for the court's extreme mercy." There was absolutely no fight left in them. It was an absolute, completely unconditional legal slaughter. Judge Harrington absolutely did not possess a single microscopic ounce of legal or personal mercy for someone who had so blatantly, maliciously abused the justice system and completely destroyed an innocent man's life. When the court officially reconvened to rapidly issue the final civil ruling, the atmosphere was incredibly heavy, almost suffocating, thick with the terrifying consequences of Chloe's catastrophic failure. Judge Harrington looked directly down at Chloe, who was now sitting completely, utterly alone at the defense table. Marcus had aggressively refused to sit anywhere near her, choosing instead to stand silently in the very back corner of the large room. His arms crossed tightly, staring furiously at the floor. "In my entire 25 years sitting on this bench," Judge Harrington began, his deep voice vibrating with absolute unfiltered contempt, "I have rarely, if ever, witnessed such a deeply calculated, profoundly malicious, and truly sociopathic attempt to completely dismantle and ruin another human being's life. You did not just tell a simple lie, ma'am. You actively weaponized the American justice system. You weaponized the deeply serious nature of family dynamics, and you violently weaponized the very sacred concept of motherhood, all to simply satisfy an incredibly petty, vindictive grudge over losing a part-time job." The judge violently slammed his gavel down to punctuate his angry ruling. "I am officially ruling completely, 100% in favor of the plaintiff on absolutely all counts of aggravated defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference. I am formally ordering the defendant to legally pay exactly $250,000 in direct compensatory and highly punitive damages to the plaintiff, to cover absolutely all lost business revenue, massive legal fees, and severe, lasting reputational damage. Chloe let out a sharp, incredibly pathetic gasp, covering her pale face with her shaking hands. She didn't have that kind of massive money. She didn't have anything remotely close to it. Furthermore, the judge continued relentlessly, ignoring her tears. I am immediately issuing a strict, 5-year permanent restraining order. You are legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of the plaintiff, his personal residence, or his place of business. If you violate this highly strict order in any way, you will be immediately arrested without bail. I am also strictly mandating that within exactly 24 hours, you will post a complete, legally drafted, highly public retraction and apology on every single one of your personal social media platforms, explicitly and clearly stating that you entirely fabricated the fake pregnancy and utterly falsely accused the plaintiff. Lastly, I am officially forwarding the complete, unedited transcripts of today's hearing, along with the undeniable forensic evidence of your deeply forged medical documents, directly to the district attorney's office with a strong, urgent personal recommendation for immediate criminal perjury and federal wire fraud charges. We are permanently adjourned. The sharp, echoing sound of that final gavel strike was honestly the most beautiful, satisfying music I had ever heard in my entire life. As I calmly and methodically packed up my legal notes into my leather briefcase, the absolute, crushing reality of the situation fully washed over the quiet room. The legal battle was officially over. I had unequivocally won. But as I confidently turned around to officially walk down the center aisle of the courtroom and reclaim my life, I was immediately confronted by the incredibly heavy, highly complicated, emotional wreckage of my entire family. Marcus was standing directly in the center of the aisle, completely blocking my path to the exit. His face was completely, brightly red, his eyes incredibly puffy from uncontrollable crying. The incredibly arrogant, highly aggressive golden boy was entirely, completely gone. He looked incredibly small, deeply pathetic, and completely broken in half. "Julian," Marcus choked out, his voice cracking violently with emotion. "Julian, I am so incredibly sorry, man. I swear to God. I honestly didn't know. She completely manipulated my mind. She played me like a total fool. I was completely, totally blind. Please, you have to forgive me. You're my brother." Right behind his shaking shoulder, my mother, Eleanor, quickly stepped forward. Genuine, incredibly heavy tears were streaming rapidly down her perfectly powdered cheeks, completely ruining her makeup. She reached out with heavily trembling hands, desperately trying to grab my sued arm. "Oh, my sweet, wonderful boy," she sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing in the aisle. "My beautiful, perfect son. We are so incredibly, deeply sorry. We were just desperately trying to protect the family from a massive scandal. Please, Julian, just come home. Let's just put this terrible, awful nightmare behind us. Let Mom make you a big, wonderful dinner." I stopped walking. I looked incredibly deeply into my mother's crying, desperate eyes. I looked at Marcus's trembling, tear-stained face. I thought intensely about the incredibly long, agonizingly lonely nights sitting entirely alone in my dark, failing shop, staring at the blank walls, desperately wondering exactly why my own flesh and blood completely threw me away so easily and brutally. I thought vividly about the heavy, loud deadbolt locking securely on my parents' front door when I stood on their porch and desperately begged them to just listen to the truth. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel the burning, explosive rage that had fueled me for months. I just felt completely, utterly, breathtakingly empty when I looked at them. The deep, supposedly unbreakable emotional bond of family had been permanently, violently severed, burned completely to ash by their own incredibly toxic actions. I calmly, deliberately reached down, firmly grabbed my mother's heavily trembling hand, and completely removed it from my tailored suit sleeve. "You absolutely didn't want to protect the family?" I said, my voice incredibly calm, freezing cold, and perfectly steady. You just desperately wanted to protect Marcus. You wanted to blindly protect your golden boy's pristine reputation so incredibly badly that you were completely willing to let me violently drown in lies. You didn't believe her simply because she was a highly convincing liar. You believed her because it was terrifyingly easy for you to think the absolute worst of me. I looked directly at Marcus, who was uncontrollably weeping now, his shoulders shaking. "And you?" I said incredibly softly, leaning in slightly. "You absolutely didn't care about finding out the truth. You just absolutely loved the perfect excuse to finally tear your independent brother down." I adjusted my heavy briefcase, stood incredibly tall, and looked them both absolutely dead in the eye. "I do not have a brother. I do not have parents. If absolutely any of you ever attempt to contact me, call my personal phone, or show up at my private property ever again, I will have Lawyer Vance slap you with a massive, crippling harassment lawsuit so incredibly fast it will make your head spin. We are completely done. Goodbye." I walked straight past their shocked faces, proudly pushing through the heavy, brass-handled wooden doors of the courtroom, completely stepping out into the incredibly bright, warm afternoon sunlight. Elias and Sarah were patiently waiting for me right by my car, holding massive iced coffees and incredibly huge, genuine, beaming smiles. "Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this incredibly far. You're truly amazing and your time means everything. Please aggressively help me by liking the video and loudly commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this exact point. This not only directly helps more people easily discover this incredible story, but also loudly lets me know that my painful experiences actually mean something to someone out there. Your constant support is the absolute greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the amazing rest of this journey." One full, incredibly transformative year has quickly passed since that highly explosive, life-altering day in the federal court. People often like to say that time magically heals absolutely all emotional wounds, but I completely and fundamentally disagree with that sentiment. Time absolutely doesn't magically heal profound, world-shattering betrayal. Time simply gives you the incredibly necessary space and clarity to deliberately build a massive, totally impenetrable concrete fortress completely around your newly established, ironclad personal boundaries. My IT business didn't just slowly, painfully recover. It absolutely exploded with massive, completely unprecedented financial growth. The very day after the final court ruling, I proudly took the highly detailed, official public court transcripts, the judge's incredibly brutal final statement, and Chloe's forced, totally humiliating public apology, and I permanently and proudly pinned them all directly to the very top of my company's official website and our primary Google business profile. I didn't cowardly try to hide from the massive town-wide scandal. I completely and utterly owned the entire narrative. I let the absolute, undeniable, legally verified facts speak entirely for themselves. The radical, unapologetic transparency worked absolute financial miracles. Exactly 1 week later, Dr. Eris Thorne walked proudly back into my newly renovated, fully staffed shop. He looked deeply ashamed of his previous hasty actions. He offered me a profoundly sincere, emotional, face-to-face apology for abruptly canceling his lucrative contracts without truly hearing my full side of the complicated story. He didn't just quickly ask to bring his massive clinic server management back to my capable team. To actively make amends, he aggressively referred me to 3 other major, highly profitable medical facilities in the county. Within exactly 6 short months, my monthly business revenue had completely tripled. I enthusiastically hired Elias as my official, full-time shop manager with a massive, highly deserved salary promotion, and I confidently leased a much larger, highly modern commercial real estate space entirely across town, incredibly far away from the toxic, suffocating whispers of the old, judgmental neighborhood. As for the true villains of my deeply painful story, the American justice system and relentless karma handled them with absolute, highly ruthless precision. Chloe, completely and utterly drowning in massive, insurmountable legal debt and entirely publicly humiliated, desperately tried to pull her classic, cowardly disappearing act. She quickly and quietly packed up her car in the absolute middle of the night and secretly moved 3 entirely different states away to explicitly avoid paying a single solitary cent of the massive $250,000 court-ordered settlement. But she severely, deeply underestimated the sheer tenacity of lawyer Vance. Vance absolutely doesn't let guilty prey escape his grasp. He immediately filed highly aggressive, multi-state legal motions to strictly enforce the heavy financial judgment directly in her brand new state. We systematically and relentlessly tracked down her new corporate marketing job and legally, ruthlessly garnished her monthly salary directly from her panicked employer. We placed heavy, completely restrictive legal liens on her personal bank accounts. Every single time she desperately tries to rebuild a comfortable, luxurious life, my legal team is right there, legally extracting the massive financial debt she rightfully owes me. She will be paying me for her malicious lies for the absolute rest of her incredibly miserable life. Her once perfect relationship with Marcus imploded in spectacular, incredibly toxic, highly explosive fashion. The massive public humiliation of the lengthy trial, directly combined with the crushing, unavoidable financial ruin, absolutely and permanently destroyed their fake fairy tale romance. They went through a highly brutal, incredibly messy, intensely bitter divorce that drained the rest of Marcus's meager bank accounts. But the final, absolute most sickening twist of the entire, exhausting nightmare didn't fully reveal itself until a few short months ago. I suddenly received an incredibly long, deeply pathetic, clearly drunken email sent directly from Marcus's brand new, hidden email address. It was a rambling, deeply desperate attempt to actively beg for my forgiveness and a fresh start. But entirely buried deep in the 3rd paragraph of his pathetic, crying excuses was a shocking confession that absolutely, violently chilled me entirely to the bone. Marcus shockingly admitted that exactly 2 full days before he violently stormed into my shop and aggressively accused me of getting Chloe pregnant, he had briefly used Chloe's personal laptop to check his fantasy football lineup. While on her active computer, he clearly noticed an emailed receipt for a highly expensive, premium Adobe Photoshop subscription. He actively saw the complex editing software wide open on her digital desktop. He absolutely knew she had zero professional or personal interest in graphic design. Deep down in his gut, he knew something was incredibly, horribly wrong. He vaguely realized the massive, glaring inconsistencies in her wildly dramatic story. But he deliberately, maliciously chose to completely ignore it. He literally confessed in the lengthy email that an incredibly dark, deeply twisted part of his mind was actually incredibly thrilled to finally see me, the highly independent, financially successful younger brother, finally get violently dragged through the absolute mud. He was so deeply consumed by his own petty jealousy and his incredibly toxic, desperate need to remain the undisputed golden boy of the family that he willingly, happily let a psychotic liar completely destroy my life just to proudly feed his own fragile ego. Reading that deeply disturbing email completely, utterly killed any lingering, microscopic shred of guilt I might have ever had about completely cutting him out of my entire life. I didn't even bother taking the time to reply to the sickening email. I just permanently, aggressively blocked the email address and completely deleted it from my secure server. I completely changed my personal cell phone number. I aggressively blocked Aunt Clara, Cousin Leo, and every single toxic, enabling relative who had blindly and happily participated in the massive town-wide witch hunt against me. My mother still occasionally tries to desperately bypass my strict, heavily enforced boundaries by sending incredibly expensive, highly guilt-tripping gift baskets and crying, pleading handwritten letters to my brand new, heavily secured business address. I don't even bother to open them anymore. I just calmly hand them directly to Elias and tell him to throw them straight into the massive metal dumpster out back without a second thought. Some incredibly naive people in our old town, the highly traditional folks, loudly whisper that I am being way too incredibly harsh, way too deeply unforgiving. They constantly say that family is family, that blood is always thicker than water, and that you have to eventually, absolutely forgive your parents because they raised you and provided for you. I completely, fundamentally, and aggressively disagree. Merely sharing biological genetic material with someone absolutely does not give them a free, lifetime VIP pass to endlessly, violently abuse you, falsely accuse you of horrific, life-ruining crimes, and completely destroy your mental health and professional livelihood. Real, genuine, lasting family isn't strictly determined by accidental bloodlines. It is determined by highly unshakable loyalty, profound mutual respect, and seeing who actually bravely stands by your side when the entire terrifying world is actively trying to burn you completely to the ground. This past beautiful Thanksgiving, I absolutely didn't sit at my parents' incredibly tense, highly toxic dining room table silently listening to their deeply passive-aggressive remarks. I proudly hosted my own massive, incredibly warm Thanksgiving dinner at my newly purchased, incredibly spacious home. I sat happily at a huge, wooden table completely surrounded by my genuinely chosen family. Sarah, who bravely forced me to fight back when I was weak. Elias, who physically protected me and proudly stood by my business when it was rapidly failing. And Lawyer Vance, who surprisingly arrived in a sharp, tailored suit carrying an incredibly expensive bottle of vintage wine, proudly smiling an incredibly rare, genuine smile. We happily raised our crystal glasses, completely, wonderfully surrounded by deep warmth, genuine laughter, and absolute, highly protected peace. I finally have the incredibly successful, peaceful life I always truly deserved, completely and totally free from the incredibly suffocating, dark shadow of my family's highly toxic golden boy. Deep forgiveness is a completely personal choice, but having any access to your daily life is a massive, incredibly valuable, highly earned privilege. And it is a privilege that my biological family has permanently, completely, and irrevocably lost forever. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own highly toxic family? Have you ever had to draw a massive, completely permanent, highly necessary line in the sand to completely protect your own deep peace and mental sanity? Share your deeply personal story in the comments below. And please don't forget to loudly like and subscribe so you absolutely don't miss the next amazing journey.